Good morning, everyone. What a tremendous honor to have you all here in this building. You heard I am Pastor Tisha Dixon-Williams of the First Baptist Church of Bridgehampton, where we are connecting, directing, and protecting. All of the things that a bridge does is what we hope to do here in this community and have done for the past 98 years. So certainly, yes. We have had so many amazing people and personalities and dignitaries grace this church, and today is certainly no different. And we are certainly happy to welcome not only Ken, thank you for supporting this program. Certainly thank you, Bonnie, for the honor of choosing our house to host these conversations. And certainly, again, thank you to all of you. So, a few years ago, there were some tourists in town in Manhattan from Europe, and they'd been traveling the world just to experience all of the architecture that America had to offer. And I was walking my dogs, and they were enamored with my two little cute sheepoos. And they wanted to know where they could see the Empire State Building. And as I engaged with them, I told them I could take them to see the Empire State Building, but we'd have to walk a little bit in order to see it. And what happened is I walked them in the opposite direction. We walked backwards about 7 blocks. And they got a little frustrated because when they turned around, they realized I had taken them further away than they had actually come. What they realized is they were standing in front of it the whole time, and I took them away from it. But what I told them was, in order to appreciate the Empire State Building, you have to step away from it. You can't stand in front of greatness and appreciate it. Sometimes you have to step back from it. I want you to know today that we are in the presence of greatness. And so while you are close to it, I'm inviting you to sit back a little bit and take in the big picture of this moment, really take in what we're about to experience today in the person of Reverend William Barber. It is an honor to have you, sir. This desk is yours. This house is yours for the day. And it's just an honor to be able to stand behind it on Sunday knowing you stood in front of it on Saturday. Thank you. You are welcome here. God bless you.
I'm gonna use that right there. Okay. That's exactly what that means. Yeah, right. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on, you move it, marching. Keep on walking, marching up the freedom way. Y'all don't know that. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. My Lord. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, marching up the freedom way. Gracious God, help us, hold us, and keep us for this moment. We thank you for your grace, your strength. We know whenever you take the risk of putting your gift in men and women, you take the risk of putting treasure in earthen vessels, sometimes faithful, sometimes flawed. But you do it because the excellency of the power rests with you and not with us. Thank you for your strength today, especially the strength that abounds in our weakness. For we ask it in your name. Amen. I want to give this pastor a great big hand. She has been so gracious. And She tried to trick me. You know, your pastor, and I'm going to say this in front of her husband. And she tried to trick me and say, well, you know, Pastor, if you don't have to go back, I'll open the pulpit up tomorrow. Really? You think I would preach? No, if I came here, I would come to listen. I wouldn't be coming. But I'm so thankful for her and for all of you who have gathered here. Sister Bonnie is nothing but the truth. Thank God for her. My two Susan friends, Susan on this side, Susan on that side. And to Ken, and I'm not going to go through everybody. My dear sister I met from Alabama, I wanted to make sure she let me know she was from Alabama. Thank you all for welcoming. Also, Reverend Dr. Della Owens, who is first woman pastor at the St. James Christian Church, 150-year-old congregation in the South. That's saying something, amen. And she is chief of security, so that's a little pensive on edge. It's okay. Yesterday, I don't know if you all know, I was at Chautauqua, 2 years ago, speaking at that same podium, and the guy was stabbed 4 times yesterday while he was speaking, because there's some nuts out here. And so I ask certainly your prayers. I won't go further with that, but just ask your prayers. I'm thinking about this center and how it was birthed out of tragedy, the tragedy of the migrant camp and the fire, 1950. And isn't it good when out of crucifixions come resurrections? And so I want you to celebrate the center today. Would you celebrate in the grace of God? And all of you who are now present and those that are in the future who will be blessed by this center. And I know that the center probably has all the resources, Ms. Bonnie, all the resources you all need and everything, especially out here. But because I believe in sowing in good soil, I just want to leave a gift today of $2,500 for wherever y'all need it the most with some children. I want to just be a blessing to the center. So to everybody who has made this possible, I keep trying to wonder what God was trying to do. We got up on Thursday, and the planes got delayed. You all been hearing about all these flight delays. 700 last weekend. Couldn't get on the plane, Susan. So we said, we're going to drive. And I'm not supposed to do that. And my doctor was like ticked off because he says, now, because I've been battling a disease for 40 years. And we drove and we kept driving and we kept driving. And then the GPS said we had 6 hours. It was 2 o'clock, and that wasn't counting rush hour traffic. So then I called folk here. We said, okay, what we'll do is go back to BWI. We'll hop on Southwest and come on in. Well, that plane was a problem. I said, now, wait a minute. Then I got mad, because, see, I get mad with the devil when, or whatever you want to call the evil. I'm clear the evil is real. And I said, there's a reason I'm supposed to be up here. And so we got up this morning, what was it, 3 o'clock this morning, and hopped the plane. And the pastor was willing to let me stay in the house, and they were going to do all kinds of things. But I'm just honored to be here with all of you today. Anti-racism, we want to talk about today, isn't black or white per se. It's democracy versus autocracy. It's justice versus injustice. It's morality versus immorality. It's racism and classism versus equality and fairness. I want to try to unpack that some today. And I bring you greetings from Repairers of the Breach that we lead, which is a movement, inspiring and empowering movement. We're working now with fast food workers. We're working with people trying to form unions in the South. We hold all of the organizing with the Poor People's Campaign, which had over 150,000 people, the largest gathering of poor and low-wealth people, religious leaders and advocates on June 18, 2022, 11 blocks down Pennsylvania Avenue. And the most diverse people from every state, over 40 different religious groups and over 300 bodies, and front page of the Washington Post. But interestingly enough, we got word that some of the major media would not be covering it, even after they said they would cover it. And so people got hot, and I said, don't get hot. You don't know the history of racism. You don't know there's a great fear in this country of poor folk coming together, poor, black, white, brown, Asian, native, gay, straight, young, old, with religious leaders. It always has been. And if you want to turn that down, some my voice is pretty loud if you can pick me up another way. But I want to wrestle with this today. You know, after I received a call that my flight to New York was delayed again and again and again, I got in my car, as I said, with Brother McDonald. He had to go back, and Reverend Della. We started driving this way. But as I was traveling yesterday on the road here and had some time to think, you have a nap or tissue, Reverend, I had a little more time than I thought I might have to ask myself a question. And the question I asked myself was, why am I a Southern boy like me going all the way up to New York and all the way out on Long Island to talk about racism? Why? And then a text came from our sister servant leader, Susan Teller, welcoming me to this space. And I responded to her, you remember, saying, let you know I would be there. And I thought tonight, which would have been the former night. And I told her, I'd look forward to seeing you. And I thought about it a little bit more. And then it occurred to me for this lecture that, for instance, people think that when that Sojourner Truth was from the South, and people think that Sojourner Truth, for instance, ran away from slavery. She was in the South, but she was in New York. And it was after the Emancipation Proclamation. Because the way the proclamation was read, if your state was not in rebellion, you would keep your slave. So when Sojourner Truth escaped from slavery, she wasn't in Mississippi, or Maryland like Harriet Tubman, or South Carolina like Nat Turner, or Virginia like Nat Turner, or like Denmark Vesey in South Carolina. She was in New York. Which means that racism really has never just been a Southern issue. But what about now, you say? Well, I remember how when I led the North Carolina NAACP in our case in 2013, we filed a case against the worst voter suppression bill after the Shelby decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act in June 25th, 2013, a day that should always live in infamy. Because the big lie did not start with Trump. I don't know where we come up with all these false narratives. Obama was in office then. And the Supreme Court ruled then that we didn't need the Voting Rights Act. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that's like taking off your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm and then complaining that you get wet. She said, you watch what happens. And all this voter suppression didn't start after Trump, it started then. We filed the first case against voter suppression, against the worst case of voter suppression since Jim Crow. We filed it 45 minutes after they signed the bill in North Carolina. And North Carolina was the test case because Obama had won North Carolina in 2008. And he didn't win on election day. He lost on election day. He won because we had fought for 2 years to win same-day registration and early voting, and we had to fight Democrats who had the majority in order to get same-day registration and early voting. And, but you have it right here in New York. because I learned during that period of time that the voting rights we were fighting to keep and fighting to expand in North Carolina were greater than the voting rights because of race-based voter suppression that you have right here in New York. So racism can never just be a Southern issue, and Northern folk can't think that somehow you're more enlightened. Because you're in a Democratic-led state, and you don't have same-day registration, early voting. We do. I wonder why that is. Could it have something to do with all of the presence of black folk and brown folk and white folk? And if they all got together, what that would do with the shift of power in this state? Yeah, we got some things to talk about. If you really want to, y'all really want to talk about race. Because racism isn't just a Southern thing. Racism isn't just about black folk. You got to deal with racism. You got to deal with racism toward indigenous people. I think this was their land. You have to deal with racism towards Latino people. What Trump did to, and his attorney general did to our Latino brothers and sisters on the border is nothing but what Eisenhower did in Operation Wetback in the 1950s and 60s. You got to know this history. You got to talk about racism towards Asian people, Latino people, brown people, black people. It's different, but it's still rooted. And you even got to talk about the collateral damage done to white people. And sadly, if you want to have a conversation about racism today, you have to have a conversation. There's not a new conversation, and that is about black folk that spew racism and push racist policies. Knew that was going to get interesting. But y'all do know in South Carolina, there was a guy, Ibram Kendi and I were talking about it, who bought his freedom and then became a slave master. And he was so bad that the white slave master said, hold up, yo, man, you too hard. So if you know that history, you're not surprised by Tim Scott, who is against restoring the Voting Rights Act. But he's as brown, black as I am. It's a peculiar way of thinking, American racism, that first revealed itself most graphically and grotesquely in slavery and also in the genocide of Native people. More and more as I'm living, I have to put those two together because they were happening simultaneously, slavery and the genocide of Native people. There was a Methodist minister who became a colonel in the Army when we were so-called winning the West, and he told his troops, whenever you find a village of Apaches, kill them all, even the children, because nits make lice. Nits make lice. And recently I've been out in Arizona with the Apache Nation there. And right now, America and some Republican and Democratic senators have signed off on legislation to take the Apache religious land, not just any religious land, their Mount Sinai, their Vatican. And when I was there with my dear friend who was one of the former chiefs, Chief Winsler, and we went out to the place where the Apache people were forced onto the reservation, and then they were forced down in the valley. The Apache people were mountain people. They like to be high. That's why they never caught, what was his name, Sitting Bull? Geronimo, excuse me, because he lived up in the mountains. But anyway, they put them in the low part, and then they opened the river to drown. And then he took me to the cliff where 150 Apache warriors would not back up defending their children and their women. And they kept pushing them until they all or pushed off a cliff. And the children of the Apache people that I've met in Arizona still have trauma. I mean, literally, they go to certain parts of that land and begin to shake. They didn't experience, and yet they did. It's in their dreams. It's in their bloodline. It's in their DNA. You can't talk about racism and not deal with all of that. But racism, in a real sense, revealed itself most graphically and grotesquely in the institution. I'm gonna give him a second because it's an echo. Yeah, there we go. In the institution of brutal chattel slavery. Can you hear me now? So I'm sorry. The chattel slavery that legally rendered captured African American people as property, just as cows, pigs, or horses. That's why when I was taught by C. Eric Lincoln, he said, whenever you talk about slavery, do not call it slavery, call it chattel slavery. That's the uniqueness of slavery in America. And slavery, chattel slavery, was rooted in 5 foundational beliefs that if you understand them, you understand why racism, systemic racism, and some people even now say don't say systemic because there's no such thing as racism that's not systemic. But what gave the philosophical underpinnings for chattel slavery was first bad biology. Biology that was generated by a French scientist. Cornel West talks about in his first book, Prophesied Deliverance. Everybody ought to read that book, Prophesied Deliverance, where he talks about the humanity of black people is a recent consideration of most of people. And bad biology, where scientists literally said you can determine brain size by skin color. But then added to bad biology, you have sick sociology. And sick sociology is that we can be around each other, but there has to be a hierarchy. Somebody has to be slave, and somebody has to be master. But then you add to that evil economics. And evil economics is the end justifies the means. If the end goal is to have more money than any other country in the world, faster than any other country in the world obtained it. And in order to do that, you have to enslave people and make them chattel for 250 years. The end, the money, justifies the means. So bad biology, sick sociology, evil economics. But then you also have heretical ontology. And that is, Pastor, that God made it like this. That from Genesis all the way over, it was outlined. In other words, to not do this is to sin. In other words, to not be racist is to sin. To not enslave people is to sin. And that's why you can never talk about racism as just a sociological problem. You have to recognize racism as a religion. It is for the racists, racism is their pivot. You know, a pivot it stays steps and then everything turns, but the turning is based on that pivot. And then the last one is political pathology. And that's when something exists and all and every political decision you make first has to ask it how you feel about this. In other words, you have to ask racism, is it okay with this bill or is it okay with this law before you can push it? Those are the foundational beliefs that I've kind of laid out over and over. Bad biology, sick sociology, evil economics, heretical ontology, and political pathology. Now, I was reading an article a few days ago thinking about why racism is still with us. Because people keep some people want to suggest that there's this time behind us. enslaved Africans from a British pirate ship, the White Lion. We do not know how many of those who were kidnapped with them died before their arrival at Point Comfort, Virginia, but those who survived were recorded as America's first enslaved Africans. From our Declaration of Independence in 1776 to the start of the Civil War in 1861, slavery posed, and the racism that created it posed a fundamental contradiction to our American identity. How could the same country whose declaration stated all men are created equal, and which held itself on high as the exemplar of freedom, allow slavery to exist? Well, part of it is even in that point, all men are created equal. Because pretty much wherever you find racism, you're going to find sexism. Indeed, there were slave markets in our nation's capital, for which we have never really repented. Unable to resolve differences over slavery, our founding fathers, that there also is problematic, because it suggests the sisters had nothing to do with the founding. They avoid mentioning, have you ever thought about, they avoided mentioning the word in our Constitution. You don't find slavery in the Constitution until the 13th Amendment. You don't find, essentially they recognize slavery as lawful by counting each slave as 3/5 of a person. But they never used the word. And that's another piece you have to know about racism. It will always find a way to code and cover itself. 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxes, there's that evil economics. And representation, there's that political pathology. However, what it does is it refers to them as other persons, which is what racism does. It others people. It looks at you and sees you have two eyes like I have two eyes, but your two eyes belong to a chattel and not to a human being. It says persons or persons held to service or labor. Historian Barber has stated that if there was a single event that caused the war, it was the establishment of the United States. See, that there was a single event that caused the war, the Civil War. It was the establishment of the United States, ... with slavery still a part of its heritage. When in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, I'm reading from this article, allowing the easy removal of cotton seeds, production of cotton, and consequently the demand for slaves soared, because remember, cotton wasn't just about selling things in America, it was about manufacturing and producing all over the world. So any conversation about slavery cannot just be about the South, because yes, those first 20 were there, but slavery began in Rhode Island. As with the other American colonies in the 17th century, in 1652, the colony, Rhode Island, passed the First Abolition Law. You don't pass an abolition law unless you're trying to abolish something. And you wouldn't pass a law if it wasn't already legalized. Now, think about that. They passed, put this, since it's a lecture, just write this in your note. Isn't it amazing that black, brown folk, or dealing with racism, we have to keep voting over and over on the same stuff? That's what Dr. King in the March on Washington, he said 100 years later. He was really being sarcastic. He was like, 100 years later, y'all, the Negro is still not free. I thought we did this in 1863. The law was not really enforced. And isn't that a problem within America? It's not the laws you have on the books, but it's what's enforced. In the 18th century, the colony's economy became largely dependent on the trade triangle. Run produce in the colony, rum produced in the colonies would be exported to Africa for slaves. These slaves would be brought to the Caribbean for molasses and sugar, and for what One historian said for the breaking, the goal of the Caribbean slave trade was to break the African so that by the time they got to the United States, they had no memory of their former selves. And actually, it was a white sociologist that said that's really impossible to do. You can break people down, but there's something that God has put in all of us that you can never really fundamentally destroy, even though you can do great damage to it. During the 18th century, Newport and Bristol became major slave markets in the American colonies. Between 1709 and 1807, Rhode Island merchants like John Brown and George D. Wolfe financed nearly 1,000 slave voyages. You said, Rambo, I thought you were going to talk about racism today. Stick with me. 1,000 slave voyages to Africa and carried over 100,000 slaves to the Western Hemisphere. By 1774, slaves made up 6.3% of the colony's population, twice as high as any other New England colony. Anti-slavery laws were passed in 1774. Anti-slavery laws were passed in 1774 and in 1784. However, the transatlantic slave trade continued even after the United States banned it in 1807. So it should not surprise us that we still have high-powered political people that violate the law. I mean, one of the things I had to shut some people down, Susan, is, and I say this kindly, but with some of my good white brothers and sisters, and one day they were talking, they came to me and said, Reverend Barber, we've never seen anything so bad in America. I said, wait a minute. I said, we need to have a little history class here. Right. Banned in 1807, by the mid-19th century, many Rhode Islanders were active in the abolition movement, particularly Quakers in Newport and in Providence, such as Moses Brown. Straining to maintain this so-called peculiar institution so vital to their economy and way of life, Southerners now defended slavery vehemently. So we had this struggle going on in Rhode Island where you had to start and you had these laws, but they weren't being enforced. And then Southerners defended, feeling themselves in mortal combat with their so-called Northern oppressors. By 1840, Southerners maintained that slavery was a great moral, social, and political blessing, a blessing to the slave. Did you hear what I said? A blessing to the slave and a blessing to the master. And what we aren't often taught, that the Civil War did not start in 1871, it started in the 1840s in the church. Because there was a civil war in the church before there was ever a civil war in the nation. Methodists went to Southern and Northern Methodists, Southern and Northern Baptists, Southern and Northern Presbyterian. In fact, there was a struggle, thank you, Pastor. There was this whole struggle over baptism. Let me see if I can pull my William Turner Dukes. You can keep it over there. He wrote about how the struggle over baptism was, well, if you baptized a slave, can they use the baptism in any way to justify their freedom? So there were two theological frameworks for that. One is, you wouldn't baptize a slave because a slave is an animal, a chattel. And their skin color is the permanent sign of that position, as well as a permanent sign of the demonic. So when the cop says about Michael Brown, he looked like that's not new. That was born in the church. That the skin color was a permanent sign of the demonic. The skin color was the mark of Cain, when actually in the Bible, the mark of Cain was for grace. But the racist flips it over and says the mark of Cain was black skin color, and it meant that everybody you see black is already guilty, that their color is guilt. So you don't baptize them. But then some said, no, you do baptize them, and you get the devil out of them, but you say to them, just because we got the devil out of you doesn't mean that you have to fight slavery, because if you hadn't been in slavery, we wouldn't have been able to get the devil out of you. Even though the oldest rendition of Christianity is in Africa. I mean, this stuff is deep. I'm going to get to us. Just hold tight. So you had this civil war in the church long before. And if you know this history, you could have predicted some of the stuff we're seeing now when Trump brought all of the so-called evangelicals to his office when he first got elected, because that's not new, right? Slavery created a far superior society to the vulgar, the vulgar Yankees. That's what they taught in the South. The slavery was better than the vulgar Yankees. The famous South Carolina politician John C. Calhoun summed up the Southern view by maintaining that slavery was a positive good. It was the most safe and stable basis for free institutions in the world. And so as we mark now 4 centuries of partial representative democracy in this land, we cannot overlook how the idea of liberty has progressed alongside the racist ideas that were used to justify the sin and policy violence of race-based chattel slavery. I hope after this lecture, if you ever talk about slavery, you won't ever say just slavery again. I want you to be like my Jewish brothers and sisters who they never say God, but they talk about they say God is Jehovah. God will provide. They don't just say God. Race-based chattel slavery. Now, America is certainly not unique in the practice of slavery throughout the history of the world, but the plantation economy and the chattel nature of slavery, where you actually say that the person enslaved is less than human because of the color of their skin, that is uniquely American. As Ibram Kendi, he and I were talking just the other day, and we've written some things together. He documented in his history, stamped from the beginning, this hypocritical contradiction was written into law before it was justified by racist ideas. Now watch this. Kendi said something that some black folk get on him about, but he's actually right on this. Race did not create racism. Racism created race. Racism is the need to identify a certain group of people who you can exploit with their power and their money and exploit it for your wealth. That came first. And then the idea of race, the created category, that idea was created as the way to limit that oppression to a certain group of people. Racism is the father of race. Race is not the father of racism. Racism then is as American as apple pie. Because what racism does, it makes sense of the hypocrisy that made the plantations work. What Ibram said, the only way the plantations could work is you had to make sense of the hypocrisy. And though American slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, American racism did not go away, it evolved. Thurgood Marshall, when he did his closing arguments before the Supreme Court in the Brown decision, said the only way this court can keep separate but equal in place is that it must tell the truth that it is the desire of this court and this nation to keep black folk as close to formal slavery as possible. Because racism is the father of race. And when we know this history, we can understand that we cannot talk about racism today without knowing what the ugliness in action and the thinking racism produced in the past that is still with us. If you know this history, and this is just a cursory review, then you would never again say, why is this still with us? Because it's hard to get away with a religion that is the underpinning of your economic system. Essayist John J. Chapman called slavery the sleeping giant. And this is what he said. He said, slavery and the racism that caused slavery is the serpent that laid coil under the table at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And every time there was even an attempt to go a little bit towards freedom, that serpent bit and poisoned those at the table. He said that same serpent awoke in the 1850s, and in 1861 with the Civil War, it envenomed our whole country, and we have not yet found an antidote to remove the poison from our veins. And one of the things that snake venom does is snake venom affects your mind. It doesn't just, it gives you fog, if you will. It makes you out of your mind. This is why we can never say about slavery or the days of Jim Crow or any manifestation of racism, that was then. You can never say that. That was then. It's important that we are here today to talk about race in America, and all of you who will see this lecture. But I need to do one more thing and say to you, I am not here today as a black man, and yet I am a black man. But because of racism, I'm not just here as a black man to talk about race. I'm here as a descendant of black, white, and Tuscaroran people to talk about how the lie of racism brought us to a crisis of democracy and has brought us to one again and again. And I'm a black, white, Tuscaroran for 2 reasons. On one side of my family, I'm a black, I'm dark in my family on one side because of the rape that happened on that side of the family. On the other side of the family, I'm light-skinned because of the voluntary coming together of some black mulattoes and Tuscaroraans in the South with whites, and who created a community called Free Union, who took on the Klan. So I got all this contradiction. You know, on the one hand, inside of my DNA is rape, where somebody white raped somebody in my family. Then on the other side is love. All that's mixed up together. Which is why when I deal with racism, I can never just talk about it from a black perspective. I have to look at it through all of these lenses. You know, it is commonplace for commentators today in American politics to lament about our polarization. You hear them all the time. How are we? We're so divided. If we could just get back to when we weren't so divided. You know, they announced that when Obama got elected. They said, it's post-racism. They lament our polarization and they talk of racism as a mere cultural dislike. If somebody just dislikes you because of your skin color, rather than an intentional systems. Conservatives and liberals alike express their desire to get back to less chaotic days. And now there's less chaotic days, for instance, before Donald Trump, but the Trump presidency did not create America's racial divide. And if you go down that road, you actually end up giving him way more credit. This presidency, and we're finding out now, it wasn't ever him because he's out of office and they got him all over the country. So that was a miscalculation too, to just root all of this into one person. But what we're finding is that this particular manifestation of racism, classism, and all the other isms has exploited tactics that were developed alongside the racist policies and ideas that emerged with American slavery and continued through Jim Crow, continued through the Southern Strategy on up until decisions about voting and just courts and economic inequality today. It's all connected. Too many say these things and they try to isolate the problem of race into the action of just one president. I got it. It looks worse than it is. Or they try to link it to just one racist rally in Charlottesville, or one or two bad police officers. They keep trying to make it an anomaly. For instance, you remember that when they marched on Charlottesville? You remember that? You know, I wonder why nobody took the time to really know why they marched to that statue. See, that statue was put up it was commissioned in 1914. It was put up in 1918, 1919 to pay homage to Woodrow Wilson, because racists believed that Woodrow Wilson would restore America to her racist strength. So when they picked that statue, Susan, to march around, they were signaling that we believe the president that just got selected is in essence a reincarnation of Woodrow Wilson. It amazes me how even in the media seems to only want to talk about racism when a prominent person calls someone the N-word, or MLK holiday when we remember racism, despite the fact that systemic racism is all around us. And sometimes, if you don't know this other history, you won't even call it that, because it does not use the language. Too often, the attempt to isolate racism as a problem of a few rather than the problem of a nation that has been envenomized, as the SSA has said, means we never diagnose it properly, because we don't seek to understand the legacy. For instance, here you go, for instance. We've got to know how in 1877 games were played, threats of violence got a vice president to go along with it to ensure that a presidential candidate, Rufus B. Hayes, who lost a popular vote, would win the Electoral College count with appointments would overturn civil rights laws and change the Supreme Court, which would make segregation and separate but equal the law of the land. In 1877, games were played during the counting of the Electoral College vote to ensure that a president that did not win the popular vote would be selected and then would get the power to reshape the courts in a way that would bring us Plessy versus Ferguson. Too often we don't talk about the many race riots, massacres, and insurrection. I don't know about you, but I was throwing stuff at the TV on January 6th. And what made me throw it, they said, oh, we've never seen an insurrection. I said, what are you talking about? This is the first of its kind. No, it's not. Don't you remember when there was burning of the Capitol during the Civil War? But what about the political riots and insurrections that took place in Wilmington, for instance, in 1898, when racists seeking to end Reconstruction, the power that former slaves and former freedmen and poor white folks started using in the South to change the South, riots happened all over this country because of the fear of black-white political power. And on November 10th, 1898, the Klan and the Red Shirts, with the blessings of the church, marched into the city of Wilmington with a Gatling gun and ran duly elected black and white progressive leaders out of office and killed 3 to 4% of the city more than died per capita on 9/11. And it was kept out of the history books for years. It was supported by politicians and preachers. If you go back and look at the pictures of November 10, 1898, they look like the pictures from January 6th. What about how after a president was elected in 1914, Woodrow Wilson, lied about the swine flu pandemic, changed the name and called it the Spanish flu to try to blame it on brown people, would not tell the country the truth, and 600,000 people died unnecessarily, but he used race to blame it on the Spanish people. And how about that same president, Woodrow Wilson, played the racist, lying movie, Birth of a Nation, that was written by a preacher from North Carolina, a senator and a preacher, which, by the way, it was to his city that Dalen Roof ran after he killed the folk in Mother Bethel in Charleston. He ran to the same place that this preacher who wrote Birth of a Nation, and Woodrow Wilson played Birth of a Nation in the Oval Office, and it was one of the most racist movies, the first sound movie, and he called it lightning in a bottle that was necessary and should be seen by all Americans to correct the lies and fake history that had been taught about the progress that happened during Reconstruction. Or why don't we talk about a study that was done by a professor at Princeton University called Purchasing the American Pulpit. You ought to read that preacher. He talks about how millions of dollars, there was a meeting in New York by a white Congregationalist preacher named Feinhall, and he met with the major manufacturers, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Sun Oil, and others, because they were mad about the New Deal and how the New Deal would have an impact on their businesses. He said to them, but you don't have the moral voice to change the view of the nation because you helped bring into existence the Great Depression. But the church still has a moral voice, but too much of the church is preaching the social gospel. So if you give me $10 million, and he was from California, I'll go out and purchase pulpits all over this country and give them another theology to preach. They basically said, if you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. If you're good, you'll be at least middle class. If you're bad, you'll be poor. So anybody who's poor is because they're not living a certain way. And they gave him the money. This is documented in a footnote. And inside of about 10 years, he owned about 19,000 pulpits across the country. And that movement was a reincarnation of slave religion, not slave religion, excuse me, the slave master's religion that Frederick Douglass has spoken out against, and then became the roots of much of the stuff that we've seen today, Jerry Falwell and all that stuff. And how about when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was listening to people like Mary McLeod Bethune and Frances Perkins, a white woman who was the first woman labor secretary, reared in the social gospel movement, and they were telling him, look, you have to have a minimum wage law. You have to have a living wage. You need health care for everybody. You need this because of this depression. And he started doing it. And this same guy who was controlling these pulpits, they began to say that stuff was socialism and communism, but most of all, it was sin, because when you help people with a living wage who are poor because they are sinful, then you don't allow them to experience the pain that they need to pay in order to repent. I'm telling you, this stuff is in the stacks, in the libraries at places like Yale and Harvard and Duke and Howard, but you got to go get it. And we don't hear it when we talk about racism. How about when Walter White, president of the NAACP, who was partially white, turned his back on Harry and Harriet Moore in Florida? Because Harry and Harriet Moore organized voting power. And they organized it to the point that it was impacting the white power structure. And the white power structure said to Walter White, if you'll stop them, we'll get some things done, and we'll also make sure some money comes into the NAACP. And he fired them, and they were blown up on Christmas Day. This serpent. We don't study enough about how a few senators from the South and the poorest states forced a compromise. Manchin and Sinema are not new. This is in 1935, 34 and 35. They forced a compromise with the president, and this is what the compromise said. Mr. President, Mr. Roosevelt, we're not going to vote for Social Security. We're not going to vote for it. But if you're going to pass Social Security, if you're going to pass a minimum wage, you must guarantee that it does not apply to the agrarian culture and the domestic culture. They never said the N-word, but all the while they were saying the N-word. Because basically what they were saying is, you cannot pass something that allows black people, because most black people were in the agrarian, the agriculture culture, or the domestic culture, or white women to be on equal par economically. And so when Social Security was passed and minimum wage was passed, hardly any black folk would benefit, and 50% of white women couldn't benefit. If we don't know this history, then we can't even have a conversation about what's going on now. And when we see what Trump has done and is doing, too many try to say is, as I said, one man, one big lie, without knowing what Dr. King tried to get us in America to see in 1965 at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. I actually think that speech was his greatest lecture. They say I Have a Dream was his greatest sermon, if you will, in this most lofty language, but his greatest lecture, and everybody ought to read it, is the speech done at the Alabama State House, when Dr. King begins to talk about what happened during the first Reconstruction in America and how it was turned back by violence. And then he says, you need to know that the Southern aristocracy, they segregated Southern minds from honest thinking. They segregated the Negro from everything. And that's what happened when the poor Negro and poor white masses of the South threatened to unite and build a great society to shift the economic architecture of the nation and create a society of justice where none would prey upon the weakness of the other, a society of plenty where greed and poverty would be done away with. When that was the threat, racism and money tore it apart. Dr. King, 65. He's killed 3 years later. When he puts his hand on that and says, I'm going to start teaching this, and I'm going to start organizing these poor whites and poor blacks and Latinos, because that is the antibiotic. We don't study enough and understand, for instance, that the tactics we are seeing now have their roots in the states' rights movement. That's why the most dangerous case before the Supreme Court now is a case out of North Carolina. And it's all been a setup. They started with voting rights. They said, we're going to gut the voting rights and see if people will go in the street. And the truth of the matter is we didn't. You know, for the most part. We were in the streets of North Carolina. We were fighting in a few other places. But there wasn't this massive outcry, right? And the Supreme Court didn't end voting rights. They put it in the Congress. The Congress has had ever since June 26, 2013 to fix it, and they haven't, right? So they said, let's test that. They did that, and they unleashed all this voter suppression. Now they've attacked women, right? And they've attacked women by ending Roe. And we've known for years we needed a national law protecting women's reproductive rights. And Democrats even knew that when they had the majority. But no, it'll never happen. They'll never. Now it's there. But what's the next step? Well, the next step is now the bill that's coming out of North Carolina, and the Speaker of the House has filed a bill arguing for state legislative sovereignty. And that's because in North Carolina, we focused on making the Supreme Court of the state and the appellate court more progressive. And so in recent days, we have turned states' rights on its head, and we've used the state constitution that was written by black and white folk after slavery. When black and white people came together in the first Reconstruction, they rewrote all the constitutions of the South. And there are some powerful constitutions. In fact, in North Carolina, the one that was written by blacks and whites says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all persons, this is 1868, all persons are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labor, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not even in the federal Constitution. And then they guaranteed public education for all persons, not all children, in the first article, in Article 1. They guaranteed voting in Article 6. In Article 11, they said the first duty of a Christian nation is beneficent provision to the poor, the orphan, and those who are hurting. This is the Constitution written in 1868. And so we've been going back, reading it, Susan, and using it and winning. We just won a case in North Carolina that says all 56,000 formerly incarcerated people now must vote, must have their vote back. The greatest in one-time shot in any state. So what is the Speaker of the House doing? They did VRA 2013, now they've done Roe. Now they want to make the state legislature sovereign. What they mean by that is, if a state legislature passes it, the state Supreme Court can't overturn it. That the state legislature has sovereignty. And we've got to study, we've got to understand this. We've got to understand what was really going on and where this is coming from, because we don't study enough when we talk about racism today, the tactics that we're seeing and how they're rooted in the states' rights movement that began before the Civil War. That was the argument with the fight to maintain slavery. Confederates militarized it. The KKK added violence. Plessy legalized it. It was picked up and mobilized and continued by Strom Thurmond and Barry Goldwater. It was continued by George Wallace in 64, 68, 672. It was made a Republican Southern strategy by Kevin Phillips and Lee Atwater, picked up by Ronald Reagan, continued by Pat Buchanan and George Bush, and Donald Trump just charismatized it. That's what's happening now. It's not new. And pushed it with media savvy that we gave him free time, playing with him. And he invested in it billions of dollars and the backing of greedy elites, and with the help of Mitch McConnell, who used to be a Democrat. From Kentucky, yeah. Oh, you got to go underneath this stuff. And you see, here's the tactic. Phillips, in 1968, and I'm almost through, advised Nixon. Listen to this now. You can find this in a book called The Time of Illusion. Jonathan Shell wrote a magnificent book. You ought to read it. The Time of Illusion, 1976 he wrote it. Here's how it went, and I want you to listen to this. Kevin Phillips, who has since repented, have that cane again, Kevin Phillips advised Nixon that the Republican Party could win without Negroes. Now, I'm not being partisan, I'm just teaching history right now. He said they could win without Negro votes. In fact, he said the way you win is you paint the Democrats as the black party. Now, Philip predicted a new American revolution coming out of the South and the Southwest, from Arizona, Texas, all the way over, because of the fears and objections raised by the civil rights movement's victories, the women's rights movement, and the LGBTQ movement and the war movement. He said, we use the animosity that's been generated by the victories of those movements. So Buchanan, Pat Buchanan, and his Nixon aide and colleague Kevin Phillips called this political plan positive polarization. That we must intentionally divide the country for political advantage and bet on the fact that people will not pick up on it. That even civil rights groups will just fight one little issue at a time and not understand what's really going on at a depth level, and why we have to finish the work of Dr. King, bringing folk together around a fusion agenda that addresses race and poverty and ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative, religious nationalism, all at the same time. They said the goal of this would be able to force everybody back into their silos. So black folk only deal with so-called black issues, white folk only deal with so-called white issues. And Buchanan said this. He said, Mr. Nixon, we're gonna cut the Democratic Party and the country in half. My view is that we would have a far larger half. We're going to use the animosity against the gay community to cut it in half. The animosity against women's rights, cut it in half. The animosity against the civil rights, cut it in half. He said, and if we cut it in half right, listen to this, even the white ethnics in the North are ripe for the picking. He said that the Irish Democrats in New York would turn Republican because they don't like the Jews and the Negroes who run the New York Democratic Party. The South, Phillips said, would become the base for a new Republican Party. Harry Dent urged Nixon to use racially coded language strong enough to persuade white Southerners that Wallace was not a viable alternative and they will turn to republicanism in droves, but not strong enough to sound like racism. They said the GOP would follow Phillips' plan. They would even pick up some Democrats that would go along with it. And he said, but anytime we get caught, their advice to Richard Nixon was to disavow it publicly. The same politicians that divide once they get elected use their power to block living wages, block health care, treat corporations like people and people like things. You hear what I just said? The same people who use the race to divide, positive polarization, once they get in office, they then use that power to block or undermine things that would lift all people. So to talk about and understand race and racism today, we must study the systemic nature of racism. Truth is, because America has too often refused to deal with systemic racism and poverty. For instance, today, there are 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country. 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country, right now. I want you to just think about that for a minute. That's 43% of this nation are poor, low wealth, and low wage, right now. And during pandemic, 8 million more people were added, while billionaires made $2 trillion as of last March. 8 million more people fell into poverty, and evictions are becoming violent now. 43% of the nation was in poverty and low wealth even before the pandemic hit. 52% of our children are in poverty and low wealth today. 66 million white people, 30% of white people, 26 million black people, 60.9% of black folk are in poverty today. How can there be any agenda to address racism that does not address poverty if 60.9% of black folk are in poverty and or low wealth or low wage? And poverty is a policy decision, not a personal failure. 68% of Latinos and natives, 60% of Asians. And those in poverty are affected by the same 5 things: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the denial of health care, the war economy, because we spend 54 cents of every discretionary dollar in the war economy today. Our war budget is, our military budget, if it was split in half, would still be more than Russia, Iraq, Iran, and South Korea and China combined. One military contract with Boeing could cover the payment of every person that needs health care in all the states that have not accepted the Affordable Care Act. So what we have is this voter suppression that allows people to get in, and it's targeted at black people. But actually, voter suppression today, the current laws that have been passed in the last year will block 55 million Americans from having access to the polls that they had in 2020, not just black people. And the goal of the voter suppression is not just to keep black folk from voting, but to get people in office who will then vote to refuse the minimum wage, to push bad tax policy, to refuse to take care of the climate, to deny health care, to push the war economy, and to push the false narrative of religious nationalism. This level of poverty in this nation, in the richest nation in the history of the world, constitutes a moral crisis of racism and classism, and a fundamental failure of the politics of greed. These numbers and interlocking injustices are not just about debates. between left, right, right, and left, moderates. In fact, Dr. King said moderates were the worst enemy of the civil rights movement because they're more interested in order than they are in change. He said that from the Birmingham jail. In fact, now, if you're still talking left, right, I believe left, right, and conservative versus liberal, I believe we're using language that's too puny for what we face now. We're in a crisis of democracy and a shared failure to center the poor and low-wealth people and the reality of racism at the center of how we do public policy. The greatest moral leaders and survivors of our society are the 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country. But there's something else that's even more grotesque. The regressive and racist policies that produce 140 million poor and low-wealth people of all colors is not benign. It is also a form of policy murder. We know that prior to the pandemic, poor people died at a rate of 700 a day, 250,000 a year. When have we ever heard that in the presidential debate? Think about it. 140 million people living in poverty, 43% of the nation. When has there ever been a presidential debate on that? When has there ever been a time of mourning over 700 people dying a day before the pandemic? 10 people died from vaping, and we had a presidential meeting in the White House. Columbia University Mailman School of Public Policy did some study and said 700 people, and this is old, this is about 5 years old. Poor people during COVID have died 2 to 5 times more likely from COVID. And I didn't say just poor black folk, poor people. We looked at the poor white communities and the poor black communities, and when it came to COVID, the rate of death was almost even, and you can't explain this by vaccination results. The truth is, the pandemic didn't discriminate, but we did. We sent people to work, we called them essential workers, gave them a hand clap, but not a living wage, and not health care, not paid family leave. And did you know that when Manchin and Sinema joined 49 Republicans to vote down a bill that would have raised the minimum wage for the first time in 12 years, and would have raised the minimum wage to a $15 minimum wage, $15 an hour minimum wage, that when they did this, remember when they did that? They joined those 49, and she danced when she did hers. Now, nobody called that racism, but we should have. We did in the Poor People's Campaign and a few other places because it was racism, because that one no vote joining with the 49 Republicans was racist in 2 ways. First of all, it disallowed a black woman vice president from casting the deciding vote that would have lifted 32 million people immediately out of poverty and their children. 32 million. And that one vote kept 43 million black people from coming out of poverty. That's racism. You don't hear the word, you don't hear the N-word, that's racism, because racism is when policies have a disparate impact. And why is it that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce openly funded Manchin, funded Sinema, and has made it known that they are against both raising the minimum wage to a living wage and restoring the Voting Rights Act? The same Chamber of Commerce that met with that preacher back in the 1900s. See the connections? Manchin said to John Lewis that he supported his bill for the People Act. The man died, and then Manchin stood. And he told the people in West Virginia he was for living wages and for voting rights expansion. And yet here we are today with less voting rights. As you sitting here in this church today, we have less voting rights protection in this country than we had August 6, 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was first ratified. Where are we with racism, you asked me to talk about? The National Academy of Sciences said that 330 lives could have been saved if we had simply had a policy of universal health care for all people. But every southern state blocked the Affordable Care Act and wrapped their dislike of the bill in their dislike for Obama and its racism, because while the gross numbers, like in poverty, there are 40 million more poor white people than there are black people in raw numbers in poverty, but in percentage, we're 40% higher. Same thing with healthcare. There are more white people that benefit from the denial of health, that get hurt from the denial of healthcare in raw numbers, but not in percentage. And if you look at American history, you can see that almost every act of racist, anti-black racism has led to policies that hurt us all. Dr. King said it like this one day. He said, you can't keep me in the ditch unless you stay down there with me. I'm gonna walk through this and I'll take questions. Take, for instance, the control of women's bodies. In the law, the control of women's body goes back to slavery first. And the desire to control black women's bodies so that white men could increase their property. But now that philosophy that was first used on black women is being pushed and used on all women with the overturning of Roe, and especially poor women. So now something that started with slavery racism that we didn't deal with then is now affecting all women, and we're having to fight for the right of privacy, because now, just like they did with the black woman, they want to give death, rape, and incest more power over a woman's body than she has. But it didn't start. And the reason it's alive today is because we didn't stop it when it was attacking black folk. Or consider the Electoral College and the filibuster. Why were they created? They were created to appease the slaveholding states in the South. But what are they being used for today? That same law that was targeted at black people is now is allowing a corporately funded minority to rule, that's obstructing policies that would help poor and low income and low wealth and low wage people of every color. Started out racism. It grows into racism and classism. Did you know that the fight against a living wage goes all the way back to when some Southern politicians fought to keep the agrarian and domestic workers out of the New Deal? Did you know that tipping that now makes even white people work for $2.13 an hour? Many of our restaurant workers couldn't even qualify for the relief under COVID because they didn't make enough base pay. Because today they make $2.13 an hour plus tax. But that didn't begin hurting white people. That began as a target to black women. The tipping system was put in place to force black women to have to work as close to slavery as possible. We're not going to pay them, we're going to tip. But now, as it has metamorphosized, it's hurting all of us. That's why you got to deal with racism, because the way it works, it might start out as just being targeted at black people, Native people. At the time, the same is true of Jim Crow and voter suppression. Why did Southern states develop voter suppression strategy? To keep black people from exercising political power without directly violating the 15th Amendment that says no one could deny or abridge the right to vote. But fast forward today, voter suppression was first targeted at black people. But even justice and civil rights organizations, we must begin to articulate, yes, it is targeted at black people, but it is also hurting everybody, which is why 55 million Americans, as I said earlier, including women, including the poor, including the disabled, are now being hurt by the voter suppression laws. And sometimes the reason we don't get traction on dealing with it is because voter suppression is still today talked about as just a black issue and then marginalized. Dr. King never talked about it as just a black issue, neither did Fannie Lou Hamer. They talked about it as a democracy issue. Or take, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act in Congress. I was talking to a friend of mine just the other day, and we said something. I can't tell y'all who her name is, but we were saying, you know, this Inflation Reduction Act in Congress, it does some good things, some things I'm glad of. My son is an environmental physicist. My two children are in public policy. We've gone through, investment in transition from fossil fuels and renewable energy, some of which are targeted to help poor and low-income communities. But we have to tell the truth. Democrats had to compromise because of a Senate that was set up not to represent the will of the majority, but to protect the so-called minority rights of the southern states. And today, even states like Montana, North and South Dakota. So yes, there were some good things, but everything that they had to take out, it seems as though anything that would have helped in large number black people, Latino people, Asians, natives, and women had to go. That's the compromise. So what had to go? All of the stuff about living wages, all of the stuff about child tax credit, all the stuff about paid family leave, all the stuff about health care for workers, all the stuff about that, all that had to go. It's almost as though we can compromise, but we're never going to compromise on something that's going to have a major impact on poor and low wealth people, black people, brown people, Asians and whites who are within that category. And so, my brothers and sisters, I've been far too long. But this is the lesson of the Reconstruction. Race has undermined the promise of America from the start. And the very fact that realities like this exist means that we are engaged in a moment today that is constitutionally inconsistent, morally indefensible, politically insensitive, and economically insane. And I'm worried about this country. As the prophet of the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, said, there comes a time when we must say, oh, let America be America again, but we must add the land that never has been yet, but must be. The poor man's, the Indians, the Negro, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, we must bring back, all of us together, our mighty dream again. We must take it from those who live like leeches on the people's lives. America, oh yes, I say it plain, America never has been America to me, and yet I swear this oath that America will be. So to deal with racism, Ken, we got to litigate and challenge every policy that violates the 14th Amendment. I don't care who it goes after. If it violates the 14th Amendment, eventually they're coming for you. And the 14th Amendment is equal protection under the law for all persons. It was the amendment that saved this nation, that saved the Constitution. It was a Reconstruction Amendment put in there by former slaves and black people and white people when they took over the states and took over the Congress. The 14th Amendment is the salvation for this country's politics. And you know, people forgot when Donald Trump first won, he talked about changing the 14th Amendment. Secondly, we must vote because poor people now represent more than 30% of the electorate and 45% in battleground states. And there are 15 states in this country right now where if poor people vote that have not voted if they vote between 1 and 26%, 4% in Florida, 19% in North Carolina, 1% in Michigan, 7% in Georgia. If poor and low wealth people of every race, creed, and color would vote for an agenda that would lift their lives, they can close the margin of victory of any campaign in those states. Now, the problem is, too often in our politics, we talk about the middle class and the wealthy. The number one reason poor and low wealth people aren't voting is because they say, nobody comes to talk about us, talk to us. Nobody talks about it. I've been from Appalachia to the Delta, hear the same thing. It's not voter suppression, even though they hate it. What they hate is nobody talks to them. And yet, what kind of politics are we engaged in when you're ignoring 30% of the electorate and 43% of the country? And lastly, to deal with racism today, we must engage in moral dissent. This is why even today, like the abolitionists and those who fought against lynching and those who have stood for families, and those who have stood for labor rights, and those who have stood for civil rights and women's rights and LGBTQI rights, and the right for women to control their own body, those who have stood for peace in the time of war, those who have demanded that children be treated right, and those who have demanded just immigration policy have had to always openly expose the moral crisis. You cannot deal with racism in the back room. You cannot deal with racism without having litigation in the court and activation in the ballot box and motivation and prophetic action in the street. It is sacred. There must be a sacred dissenting, moral dissenting. That is the only key way that you can exorcise the demons of racism and greed in our society. There is no time in history where we've ever been able to be close to taking out the venom of racism where there hasn't been a massive moral movement in the street. Nowhere. In fact, the Declaration of Independence demands that you have it, because the Declaration of Independence says whenever there has been a long train of abuses, it is the right, it is the duty of the people to alter or change that form of government whenever it is in violation with the fundamental principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our greatest moral traditions and scriptures tell us that we can't be quiet. The moral dissent has to happen. Pharaoh must be challenged. False prophets, even if they look like you and come from your own people, must be challenged. God said in Ezekiel chapter 22, can I find somebody who will stand in the gap that I might save the nation? In every generation, somebody got to go down in the valley of dry bones. And remember that the people might be hurt, they might be broken, they might be like dry bones, but dry bones can still hear. And if you preach to dry bones, they'll stand up. They'll organize, and then God will put spirit on them, and that which was rejected, the stone that the builders rejected, can become the chief cornerstone of a whole new reality. There are always moments in history where in the anointing, as a matter of my faith, we must declare good news to the poor. The Greek word there Jesus was put on Jesus' lips is patokos, P-T-C-H-O-S, which means those who've been made poor by system of economic exploitation. We must have fasting in America, but not the doing without food, but the kind of fasting that's called for in Isaiah 58, fasting from evil. Fasting from unforgiveness, fasting from the wickedness of not paying people what they deserve. Racism and classism are linked, and linked, and they are. We must examine every policy under the deepest critique of our moral and religious values. As long as there are 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country, and we know it does not have to be, we must fight for a third Reconstruction and refuse to be silent or unseen or unheard anymore. As long as there are 87 million people right now who are uninsured or underinsured in the country in this world that spends the most on health care, and of the 25 wealthiest nations in this world, we are the only one, that is our particular uniqueness, we're the only one that does not offer some form of universal health care, even though every congressperson, once they get elected, they get free health care, the best paid for the people. We must demand a third Reconstruction, and we can't be silent or unseen or unheard anymore. As long as people go to bed hungry every night in food deserts, as long as millions of our neighbors are homeless, are facing homelessness, when we have more vacant homes and vacant lots than we have homeless people, as long as 4 million people get up every morning and they can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water, as long as our military spends twice as much as Iran, Iraq, Russia, North Korea combined. And as long as if we just took 10% of the bloated military budget, it could provide health care and public education. As long as 55 million people face voter suppression, as long as 32 million people in this country work for less than $15 an hour, and there's not a county in this country where you can work at $7.25 and afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. As long as 4 million families were thrown back into poverty because of the refusal of 49 Republicans and 2 Democrats to at least keep the child income tax credit growing. As long as the lies of scarcity keep being used, when we do not have a scarcity of resources, we have a scarcity of moral consciousness. As long as people in power say we don't know what to do and we know they are lying, as long as people keep asking how much will it cost if we fix this, rather than asking the real question that Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Peace Prize economist, says we ought to ask, and that is, how much is it costing for things to stay like they are? How much are we wasting on child poverty? How much are we not seeing in the economy because we don't pay living wages? How much is it costing us to be a nation that doesn't provide health care? How much does it cost us to keep poverty alive rather than eradicate it? How much does it cost us to embrace voter suppression? And we who do this critique, in this iteration, when we have our challenges, every generation has its challenge. If we're going to do this, if we're going to really address race, we've got to be black and white and brown and native and Latino and Asian and young and old and Republican and Democrat and independent. We got to be from California to the Carolinas, from Massachusetts to Mississippi, from Georgia to the Great Lakes of Michigan, from Appalachia to the Apache lands to Alabama, from Montana to Missouri, from Alaska to Arkansas, yes, from New York to North Carolina. From every place in this country, there must go up a sound that sounds like Rachel, weeping and mourning, and refusing to be comforted because too many are being hurt. And like Rachel, we must refuse to be comforted until change comes. The goal of racism is to shut our mouths. But justice demands that we declare we won't be silent, unseen, or unheard until justice comes. Amen. stuff. And when people say, come and talk about something and give us an analysis, I try to take it seriously. But, you know, an analysis is an analysis. It's not just a few cute phrases and you get up and holler and everything. That only keeps us stuck. I don't know of any anti-venom serum that has been developed without a whole lot of discussion, a whole lot of thinking, and a whole lot of work. Yeah, so.
Well, Dr. Barber, I thought your comments were brilliant and your analysis much needed. And I'm honored to be here to cover this point in time with you.
Thank you, sir.
In the interest of time, I think I'll cut to the chase. You and I discovered in the run-up to this talk that we had a good friend in common, James Cone, who I taught with down in Little Rock, Arkansas back in the last century. He already had his doctorate in theology, and he was, I think, at the Union Theological Seminary
That's
when
right.
he wrote that book, Martin and Malcolm and America.
That's right.
And what you've done in the Poor People's Campaign, and I think people here should maybe go to your website and look at the very well thought out principles and the audit and everything that you, all the thought that you and your colleagues have given to it. And I'm not saying that because Charles Blow compared you in a recent article to a modern day Moses, but it is kind of a tablet for what needs to be done. But in the Poor People's Campaign, you mentioned Martin Luther King several times in the course of your remarks. And I'd like to get to the question of where the civil rights movement stands today in light of your analysis. You know, Martin King evolved in his ministry.
Yeah.
And by the end, he was getting towards the kind of connections that you've made. And in fact, there was a Poor People's Campaign that took place, actually was led by Coretta King after Martin King was assassinated. Took place in Washington, and then Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and it kind of folded its tent, if you will. And then here you come, as I think, a legitimate heir to the work of Dr. King. And you've taken it a step further, and you've tied it all together, and you've said that the interlocking injustices of systemic poverty, systemic racism, ecological devastation, and the war economy, and distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism, are all tied together. But what interlocks them? And I'll have a follow-on question to that, but hopefully that will stimulate an answer about the organic relationship between Dr. King's work, his evolution, and how you're putting it together in light of that precursor.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ken, for bringing up the memory of James Cone. He was one of the people I sat with, along with some Jewish rabbis and some other brothers, Islamic brothers. I took a sabbatical at Union before we started the Poor People's Campaign. We had started repairs of the breach, and I was thinking about leaving the state conference NAACP. And I wanted to sit with some people and really wrestle with theology from the perspective of economic injustice. And when I do that, see, when people ask me, is it race or is it class, I say it is. I think it's a false to try to separate. You never can submerge race underneath class because racism has its, but you have to always understand that inherent within racism was this evil economics at the base of it. And so I spent some time with him, and we studied a lot about, you know, when James Cone talked about black theology, a lot of people miss, he wasn't talking about race just as terms of skin color. He was talking about blackness as a metaphor for unnecessary, unearned, and unjust suffering. And how do we address the suffering of the world that is created? You know, Coretta Scott King said, right after her husband was killed, murdered, shot, somebody asked her, what does she think about violence? And she said, well, violence is far more than my husband being assassinated. She said, taking a child's culture is violence. She says, refusing to give people health care is violent. Refusing to pay a living wage is violent. And then she said, and even an apathetic attitude that refuses to address these other forms of violence is itself a form of violence. You know, I struggle some with the notion that Dr. King evolved, because in 1958, I think it was, when he was still pastoring the church in Montgomery, Dexter Avenue, he preached a sermon entitled Paul's Letter to American Christians. And in that letter, he talked about how the 1% were ruling over the 99, and that in order to address racism, we also had to address what racism means in terms of economic injustice as well. If you listen to him in 63, actually in 58 also, when he does the prayer vigil to Washington, D.C. with others, and he says, give us the ballot. And in that run, we call it a preacher's run, he lists also the economic realities. And then in 63 at the March on Washington, if you go back to the speech he did in Detroit a few weeks earlier, with the I Have a Dream section was much more in depth. But if you listen to the speech on August 28th, he talks about America, this check that keeps coming back marked insufficient funds, and we refuse to believe that. So even then, you know, and then of course in 65, at the March on Washington, excuse me, in 64, he and John Lewis were both, and others were thinking about not, and Fannie Lou Hamer also, supporting the 64 Civil Rights Act, because they compromised out all of the things that would have implications on economic power. And then lastly, in 65, he tied the Voting Rights Act squarely to the only way to turn back the goal of the Southern aristocracy, and that was to keep black folk and white folk from coming together, using race as a wedge issue because of the fear of them coming together, forming reshaping the economic architecture of the nation. And then, of course, you know, in 68, he connected the three: poverty, racism, and militarism right at Riverside Church, a year exact to the day he was assassinated. And he left there and went on a tour. Now, by the way, it's interesting that after that speech, you talk about where the civil rights movement was, almost every civil rights organization wrote and passed resolutions against Dr. King. And let me just close here and say that they did that, and he was isolated, but he was talking about that book called Two Americas. So you ask me, how do they intersect? You know, it's a one thing. My son is a physicist, and he said to me one day, Daddy, some things just do. And I said, what? He said, I've learned. Now, he's an environmental physicist. And he says, some things just do. You really can't ever fully, I mean, you can hypothesize and all of that, but at the end of the day, we know this. The same political forces that promote policies of racism, even if they don't call it that, but when you look at the impact of the policies, those policies have disparate impact among black, brown, native, Asian people. Those same forces, let me make it simple, the same forces that, for instance, support racist voter suppression, if you look at their voting record, they support anti-labor laws, they support anti-healthcare laws, they support, it's almost, I mean, almost verbatim, but you can't separate it. And when we were in Appalachia, and this is where this thing really popped open, we went to Harlan County, Kentucky. And I do hope that the folk here will go to www.breachrepairs.org and click on the videos and the testimonies and look at it. And I hope you will at least take a look and send it to the Poor People's Assembly, Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington and to the polls June 18th. But here's a quick point. We were out in southern eastern Kentucky on a Tuesday, and people had told me, said, you better not go out there. And they said, do you know where you're going? I said, yes. I said, it's Harlan County. Harlan County is the county from which Justice Harlan came, and Justice Harlan was the only Supreme Court justice that voted against Plessy versus Ferguson. But a lot of people don't know. And also Eastern Kentucky is where the song was developed, Which Side Are You On? That you hear young black folk in the Black Lives Matter singing, but that song was actually developed by a white miner's wife when they came to arrest her husband. But anyway, we were out there, I'm sorry, but we were out there and we were in a room, 500 people showed up in Eastern Kentucky, right, in Harlan County. They call it Trump country, but we found it was people, human beings. And I put this map up, Ken, on the mall, and I said, I want you to see something. And I showed them their legislative body and where they voted. I said, here's all the people in your legislature that voted against, or voted for voter suppression. Oh, by the way, here are the ones that voted against union rights. Oh, here are the ones that voted against health care. And this guy stood up in the back. He was a McCoy, you know, like the real half-is McCoy. He said, Barber, and I'm not picking the way he talked. He did talk. He told me this whenever I told this story to say it like he said. He said, Barber, show that damn map again. And I said, what? He said, show that map again. He said, well, I will be damned if we ain't being played against each other. I said, and that's my point. I don't know when it intersects. I just know it does. And I know that if you can get people to see that, because we did, and 3 of those 5 counties we went in ended up turning from Trump counties to other Democratic counties and elected and unseated a Republican governor who was an all-out extremist. The point is, they do connect. And if you take the time to research it, we see it very clearly. And if they are radical and mean and extreme enough to be together, we ought to be smart enough to come together. That's the point.
Well, so I take your point. And what happened with Dr. King as the Vietnam War raged is he became clearer and clearer on the interconnection. And he said, we must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there's a radical redistribution of economic and political power. So getting back to our friend James Cone, he was contrasting the thinking of Dr. King and Malcolm X as they evolved. And they, in a strange way, did begin to move towards each other, towards the end of their lives. But Malcolm X didn't have good things to say about white liberals, or white people generally, in the early part of his thinking. I always admired him greatly, but he didn't have good things to say about preachers and the black establishment either. And he defined violence as not including what you do to defend yourself. And that strain between integrationism and separatism exists today. And violence is in the air. You can feel the fabric of American society being rent, being torn asunder as all the institutions, including the church, come under, well, a lack of belief, a lack of support. So what do you say about those two strains and the question of violence? Do you think that the establishment will go for a radical redistribution of economic and political power without violence? What is the future of the civil rights movement now?
Well, I don't know if they'll go for it. I think we have to, it's about remaking the society. And we talk about violence versus nonviolence. Nonviolence, you know, that never means non-engaged. It never means non-active. What we're trying to say is that the very soul of the nation is in trouble. This nation's foundations cannot handle the strain of nearly 50% of its people living in poverty, while you have all this great wealth, you know, in other pockets. You know, during COVID, we gave 68% of all the COVID relief money to corporations. 68%. We've had more billionaires made during COVID. I mean, at some point, if that void does not get filled with truth, justice, love, revolution, values, and people engaged, it's going to be filled with something. In some ways, you know, what we saw on January 6th could be a precursor. I mean, what happens if 140 million people lose hope? What happens if majority of them do? What happens if people began to believe that their government is more interested in creating violence upon their bodies and their lives than promoting justice? You know, what if they no longer believe that establishment of justice and providing for the common good and promoting the general welfare are even principles with which we believe or which we're even trying? What do you do with that? I don't want to see that because I don't know. Nobody can predict. What we can know is that anytime we have seen it in other places, that's where autocrats arise, demagogues arise, political violence arises around the world. And what we should be doing is saying it doesn't have to be like this. Now, I don't think it's going to just happen because all of a sudden some people in government are going to become altruistic. And as I said, even the Declaration of Independence didn't say that. It said we have to alter. And that is why I think that we have to build this massive moral movement. And what we're trying to do is we cannot find any place in history where there was not a massive moral movement alongside fundamental change. I also think that we don't just keep reaching back to the 60s as the only model. I think that's problematic. That's why in our movement, we go all the way to Reconstruction, because we think there's a model that actually where black and whites came together in the South, poor and low-wealth black and white people, and formed political coalitions that in fact were successful in fundamentally changing the Constitution, and they were only put down because of violence, right? So can we go back? We said we've got to pick up that model. We have to engage this sleeping giant. We have to engage every tool of litigation. This is a fight. This is and part of it, lastly, I would say is, you know, the way we do our politics, as I said, you can go look at the last 8 presidential years and the debates. Not one debate on poverty. Not one 15 minutes on poverty. Not one 15 minutes on racism. You know, if we're not even in the conversation, we're never going to be in the solution. And so, you know, we have to continue to move and push in a way, because what people are just being left out of the entire focus, and that is dangerous, I believe, for this democracy. King said it like this: what do you do when you fought to integrate the house and then the house is on fire, or you integrate into a burning house? But I don't believe we're at the point past hope. I do believe that the stones that the builders rejected now have a unique possibility. We have most of the things we see. Southern states are not red states, they're unorganized states. Many of the things we need passed that were passed in this last House, Congress that we had, just didn't happen in the Senate. We have the possibility right now of changing that Senate by 5 more people that could fundamentally shift. But we've got to get beyond the pundits. Because if you listen to pundits, the midterms have already happened and everything is bad. And they don't even factor in, what if there was a 20% increase in poor and low wealth voters around an agenda? And there's something sick about that, in the way in which even the corporate media sometimes promotes that. I had somebody tell me, Ken, they said, you know, the corporate media really doesn't want to talk about poverty. They don't. I mean, I thought about that. We had 150,000 people march on D.C. June 18th, and we were the resurrection and not an insurrection. You put the insurrection on TV. But you got 150,000 people of every different race, creed, and color from every state talking about an agenda, and you act as though that's nothing. That's part of the problem, too. Too many people benefit from the fight. Too many people are benefiting from the lies. Too many people are benefiting from keeping people at odds, and that's why there has to be a moral movement that breaks through
Thank you for that. Well, I'm going to ask one last question. I think we can wrap it up. I had a moment's thought that maybe you were making this connection between black people and poor people as a tactical move, because black people are less than 13% of the country. By including poor people, you get a much larger force behind you, and yet it does fit together. It's an analysis that others have come to, and it makes a lot of sense, and you've been brilliant at making these interconnections. But where does, say, reparations fit in? For example, I recently reread Angela Davis's interesting book about abolishing prisons. And of course, it's a way of starting a conversation. You realize that you can't abolish the prisons unless you change the political economy of American capitalist democracy. Are you willing to talk about reparations despite this important decision to make this a poor people's campaign? Where does reparations fit in?
No, because we didn't make it a poor people's campaign. So we always hold race and class together. And that's the uniqueness of our campaign. I don't talk differently in Appalachia than I do in Alabama. We know this race, it's poverty, it's ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, the false moral, natural, religious nationalism. It's just like this hand. Now, you can cut this finger off. You don't think these other fingers gonna hurt? But also, if you ball these up, it becomes a fist. So we're saying if these are where the attacks are, and Howard Thurman said that you judge your strength by the way that your enemy attacks you, because your enemy is attacking all these areas. If we can get all these areas to stop being silos. Let me give you an example.
Well, can you make the connection for me with war? Where does the war economy?
Oh, I'm going to make, yeah, okay. I think we can, and with reparation too, because that's in our agenda. What if on this past bill that we just saw pass, my son is an environmentalist, I told you. If the environmentalists that they went to and said, we're going to put this in, are y'all okay with this? If they had said no, unless you include the voting rights bit. And what if the voting rights piece, if they came to us and said, we're going to pass voting rights, we said no. We're not going to accept that till you do the living wages. And they said, but that's different. We said, no, it's not. Because if you mess up the climate, you kill me, I won't need to vote anyway, and I won't need the money. If you give me money and don't fix the climate, the money die. So we have to constantly make the connections by disaggregating the numbers. That's one of the ways you do it. That's why in all of our research, we disaggregate the numbers. So it's not that we make the connections, it's the connections are there. So when we talk about, because when we started this campaign, I remember, Ken, when people on the Congress would cuss us out. They said, no, it's not. It's 39 million poor folk in this country. I said, no. And I thought it was lower than 140 million. Tell the truth. That's why we always believe in research first, because the worst thing you can be is loud and wrong. And so we said, let's get the best economists, the best sociologists, the best impacted people, and let them do this study called The Souls of Poor Folk and get an audit done. Let's do an audit, because America understands an audit. Let's really get the numbers. And when they came back and said 140 million poor, no way. They said, yeah, and then they said, but here's the deal, that the Congress uses the political poverty measure as a way of not dealing with the issue, because the poverty measurement is so low that it really doesn't address the issue of poverty, low wealth, and low wage. And we always say poverty, low wealth, and low wages, not just poverty or poor. And so by us using 200% of the poverty level, that gets you to a more complete analysis of poverty and low wealth in the country. But then I said, but go back now and disaggregate. And they said, and some of the people around the table said, no, we don't want to do that, because if you say that there are 66 million, with 40 million more white people that are poor than there are black, then some people are going to use that to dismiss the way in which poor blacks have a larger percent. I said, no, they won't. Disaggregate it all. Show it all.
to the whole country. So wherever we go, we say, here's the number, 140 million. Then we disaggregate, and we show the 66 million raw number white, but that's 30%. But then we show the 26 million black, but that's 60.9%. And the more you talk in that, people see their interconnection. And then how do we connect the war to it? We connect the war to it by showing how the exorbitant amount of bloat in the military budget disables our ability to address the issues that are at war with poor and low wealth people, i.e. living wage, i.e. healthcare, i.e. the environment, and that it does not have to exist. So part of what it is you constantly teach. And then lastly, Ken, the way we make the connections is, you know, somebody, like you said, some people made a move to bring this up in order to do that. Well, see, for me, as a pastor, that is one of the uniqueness. Some of the King was pastor. I'm a pastor. So the connections are made to me every time I got to bury somebody that doesn't have health care. I don't care what color they are. It's made when they can't afford to choose medicine or choose water or gas. And then for me as a Christian, a person that's very open to all faith, but for me as a Christian, any move to include the poor is a Jesus move. Straight up. It's a way, it's a move which if I don't make it, I am actually claiming I'm not Christian. I'm denying the very faith I profess. But in this culture, as I said, is it class or is it race? Is it race or is it class? It is. And part of the thing that we have to do is we have to wrestle with all of it. And lastly, Ken, at some point, America is going to have to decide that death is no longer an option. Because every unjust piece of public policy, whether it's attack on women or voting rights, if you dig deep enough, and sometimes you don't have to dig that deep enough, produces some form of real death. I'm not talking about imagining real death.
Yeah.
And I think that in today's civil rights, you asked about that. You know, I tend to say we're a moral movement, does civil rights. But in today's civil rights movement, my greatest prayer is that the leadership of civil rights does not become isolated. You know, all of the great civil rights leaders of our past were expanding to human rights. You know, Du Bois, King, they weren't leaving race out. They were saying, like for instance, somebody asked me, why are you so adamant to support the gay community? I said, because I'm black. And they said, what do you mean? I said, because I'm black. They said, what do you mean? I said, because I know what happens when you codify discrimination in the law. It'll have you stuck in something for 250 years, another 100 years, and you're out of it. So why would I sit around and allow somebody to codify discrimination against another group of people when I know? And so I pray we don't get stuck like the only issue we're focusing on. And I said this to the Black Caucus in Love in the Congress. I said, I don't understand, how can you be the Black Congressional Caucus and poverty is not a centerpiece of your agenda? I'm not talking about that you grew up in poverty, because sometimes you start talking about poverty and black folks say, I know what it'd be like to be poor. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how can you have 60.9% of your people in poverty and it not be a centerpiece in your analysis of racism and all the other isms? How can you be a pastor of a predominantly black church, for instance, and 60.9% of the people sitting in the pew are poor and low wealth? And the Pew study did a study not too long ago on messages that are happening in the pulpit, and poverty didn't even register. You know what registered? In the white church, salvation registered as the thing most talked about. And I'm not being facetious. In the black church, hallelujah, as a subject, as a word. But poverty, even though in the Bible there are 2,000 scriptures on the issue of poverty and injustice toward the least of these, if you cut them all out, the Bible falls apart. Jesus' first sermon was about addressing poverty. His last sermon was about addressing poverty. And he said that every nation that didn't address it would be ultimately go to hell, as Dr. King talked about it. And yet, in the American pulpit, even today, poverty is hardly, if ever, dealt with, and racism either, and certainly not the intersections between the two.
Well, I think this is a good time to thank you for the connections that you've made and the way you've pulled it all together. You know, the Rand Corporation just completed a study of what makes a nation strong. And one of the key elements is inclusion of diverse elements, bringing them in to the mainstream. And I just like to take this moment to thank you for your ministry and all you're doing to save America and bring us to our better selves.
And Ken,
Thank you very much.
maybe one thing we ought to do before you close it that you did, maybe we ought to say the mainstream is not the mainstream because it doesn't include all the people. And maybe we see all this language, like why do we call people right, say they're on the right, and then spend 30 minutes trying to convince folk they're wrong? I think we have to have an American Pentecost and get a whole new language, a way of talking, right? Because if you're using the wrong language, you don't develop the right imagination. And imagination, moral imagination, always precedes moral implementation. So, Ken, I'm glad that you do this. I'm glad that you all do this. I feel privileged and honored to have been invited. I still have hope. I'm not always an optimistic person, but I'm a hopeful person because hope is greater than me. And what I know about hope, and I'll close with this, is something that one of the theologians said. He said, ultimately, hope is when people decide that what is causing them to despair is unacceptable by their moral traditions, and they engage themselves nonviolently and become the hope that they seek.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Great.
Get on the road now, leave you. Bonnie, give it up for Bonnie.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. See you at our next Thinking Forward lecture series, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.